Hello, families. Welcome to our Autism Exploration Series. I'm Emily Hanson, a Regional Director at Rural Beginnings. Rural Beginnings' mission is to change lives for our clients, families, and our professionals, and we do that through our Pledge of Care, which is our promise to you to provide effective treatment through compassionate care. We also strive to achieve our mission through our core values. One of our values is education, teaching families valuable ways to work with your child, and that's why we started to do these series. You will see that we have our seals of Behavior Health, Center of Excellence, and the seal from Autism Commission on Quality, and these seals represent the hard work and focus that we place to ensure that BB is providing quality care through the highest standards. Next slide, please. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce you to the services that we offer here at Rural Beginnings. In addition to our in-home and center-based ABA services, we also offer diagnostic services, feeding therapy, and social skills programming. Additionally, we encourage you to participate with us today through the presentation by using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning during this recording, which you can access by navigating to the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click the closed caption button on the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the presenter for the evening, Rebecca Womack.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everybody for joining us on Thanksgiving's Eve. That's a thing. It is now. Yep, like Emily said, my name is Rebecca Womack. I am a board certified and licensed behavior analyst. I am pleased to serve as the Vice President of Quality Assurance for Rural Beginnings. But before I get into today's presentation, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I live in Oklahoma, in the country, on a hobby farm with my husband, and we have animals and dogs and the privilege of beautiful sunsets. So very thankful for that. From a professional lens, though, I've had the privilege of working with families and centers and facilities all across the country and overseas in a variety of capacities. And so I'm so thankful for the opportunity to chat with you guys today, because one of the things that is super important, not only to myself, but to as a reflection of the core values that Rural Beginnings has, is to compassionately share and help disseminate information for caregivers who are interested in learning about ABA services or going through ABA services, to equip you with tools necessary to help you feel successful, to get the most out of the experience, and to share things that you may or may not have been aware of. So today, this is like a really informal discussion. I want you to feel like, as I'm sharing things with you, if you have something to say, feel free to drop it in the chat box. You can ask your question at any time. You don't have to hold it till the end. But the point of the webinar today is for me to share with you information that you might have heard pieces of around, but my hope is to put it into a full picture to give you an understanding of what to expect from your ABA provider from beginning to end of care. So today you should expect to learn what the standards of care for ABA services are, to have some expectation management around assessment activities and treatment plan development, what that entails and what that should look like, essential questions you can consider asking your ABA provider along the way, and some strategies for raising concerns, because it isn't always the most comfortable thing to ask someone who is a provider in your family's life uncomfortable questions. So before we dive into the process, I wanted to just share a little bit about ABA standards. This is important because standards really level set the playing field for all behavior analysts who become healthcare providers and deliver services, ABA services from a health plan to the health plan's member, which is you, and you become the client of the provider. So when we talk about, first of all, standards of care, this refers to the level of care and treatment that is recognized as acceptable and appropriate by reasonably similar healthcare providers. So essentially, some of the standards of care that you see on the screen here are documents that were contributed by organizations, whether they're provider organizations, nonprofit, trade organizations, made up of members who are considered to be experts in different categories in the field of ABA, and they have agreed upon or collected information based on the document type. And I'll go through some of those documents in a little bit more detail in just a bit. But when it comes to the standards of care in general, you might think, well, how or why do these standards of care come to be, and what do they mean? Like, what's the point of them? It might be helpful to look at it from the lens of category and function. So standards of care, first of all, usually fall into different categories based on who they are intended for. So there's standards of care, and there's, you don't have to know all the titles of them, but just those are examples for the field of ABA, fall into the first category where they cover clinical implications. So clinical implications for documentation, what providers should be producing as they deliver clinical services. And the rationale is that, it's not Steve or Joe or Lisa over there in Iowa sitting down and thinking, well, I think the standard of care should be, XYZ, but it's standards that are agreed upon, developed by the nonprofit associations, formed through consensus and exhaustive peer review to set the bar of the expectation, not only for the clinicians, but also for all stakeholders who will intersect with services. There are other relevant sources that are clinical that may not necessarily reflect what you need to document, but inform the documentation process as well. Then there are standards that are considered organizational. So these standards tell organizations like Verbal Beginnings, here are ways to practice delivering clinically excellent services, or how to develop quality indicators that help drive the function and the business model of your organization. And again, the what and why is around supporting not only best practices for the organizations, but giving guidance to the organization how they can think about their infrastructure to support sustainable, high quality services, as well as put benchmarks out there for the industry. Because everybody might understand, for example, the word quality, but when it comes to a universal understanding of what that means as a benchmark for services, like a quality session or a quality treatment plan, it's the field, and in this instance, the trade organizations that determine what those benchmarks are. And then the final category of standards is accreditation. So like Emily mentioned at the beginning of the introduction of the presentation, Verbal Beginnings is accredited by 2 organizations. I think we are one of the only ones in the country, if I'm not mistaken, that holds this honor. But what this means is that we have met rigorous standards by 2 different organizations who have determined the bar for not only the clinical activities of our organization, but the documentation practices, training, processes, systems, so that what we're doing, even if we think it's good, also has been checked by a third party, an accreditation organization, and has been measured and has met their bar for success. And that process is pretty intensive and exhaustive, but it's worth it, because now we can say, and any other organization who holds these accreditations can say, we've met the bar. So I want to kind of take a microscope and focus in a little bit on some of the standards of care specific to ABA services because I think the information in some of these documents will be helpful for you as a caregiver or a stakeholder who, has some impact or role in the delivery of ABA therapy. So the first standard of care is really around how services should be carried out from front to end, as well as what the model of service delivery should look like, and recommendations around how the oversight of the services should be carried out. So in the Council of Autism Service Providers practice guidelines for applied behavior analysis, there's a lot of helpful information around the service structure, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a second. But really, this informs you of the different ways that your child can receive services from the healthcare provider. This also provides health plans who fund the services insight into what those standards of care should look like when it comes to the service structure itself. The next area that is helpful to know is the details around case supervision. And this is a term that is often used in the industry, but has a variety of different meanings based on who you're talking to. In this instance, case supervision speaks to the clinical activities that your behavior analyst will follow to ensure that your child receives the best quality care. Those clinical activities fall into two categories, direct and indirect, and the guidelines further specify how much time approximately, because they are guidelines, they're not rules, your behavior analyst should be spending doing each of those different activities. And then the third area of interest is the section on treatment development. So as your service structure and your case supervision is spelled out, really, those don't really mean anything if you don't have a treatment plan. And so the treatment development is a longer process that includes the behavior analyst conducting an assessment, doing a variety of different activities, and finally producing a work product called the treatment plan that they'll review with you and send to the health plan. And this document here talks about the different guidelines around all of those different phases of service. The next document is also very important. This document has gone through a variety of different updates over the years. And so in its current iteration, it is the ethics code for behavior analysts by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. A lot of words. The point is that all behavior analysts who have certifications, like myself, are required in order to maintain their certification status to uphold the Code of Ethics. And in the Code of Ethics, there's essentially two basic parts to the code. There's 4 principles that are discussed in detail that describe the traits that a behavior analyst should exude through their interactions, not only with stakeholders who they may encounter during delivering ABA services, but if they're professors conducting research, or if there's supervisors overseeing supervisees becoming BCBAs. The code really does apply to is intended to apply to the 360 view of the behavior analyst as they conduct themselves as a professional. Now, it's certainly not all encompassing. It's hard to make, guidance up for everything that you might encounter in life as a professional, but it is very comprehensive. And to that point, it does address the ethical considerations and ethical standards that a behavior analyst has to uphold when they're delivering services. And the implication is that if you're not upholding certain ethical standards, this could potentially put your certification at risk. Furthermore, if your state, which I currently live in Oklahoma, but Verbal Beginnings is a multi-state organization, and so their corporate office is in Maryland, which is a licensure state. So if your state has a licensure act which governs the practice of behavior analysis, that state's code may absorb the code of ethics as part of state law. So essentially, violation of the code of ethics is by effect violation of the state administrative code governing the practice of ABA. So there's a lot that can be discussed about the code of ethics, but for the sake of today's conversation, I just wanted to touch on 3 areas. The first is it really specifies standards that behavior analysts have to consider when designing services for the family. So this encompasses not only putting in writing the agreement of what services should look like, but communicating expectations to the family, explaining what they should anticipate, risks, benefits, things for them to consider as the caregiver for the child receiving care so that they can make the best decision in the interest of their child. It also provides clarity around all the different elements that the provider or the behavior analyst should think about when providing consent or giving the caregiver and the client opportunity to consent to services. And then it provides a timeline by the effect of the design of the standards around what happens when it comes to receiving services. So, essentially first, there's a need for services that's identified through the assessment process, and then it talks about what to expect during the assessment process, overseeing care, what the behavior analyst is ethically obligated to think about, and then finally, what happens if the child exits from services for discharge and what those reasons might be. So those standards, and there's more, that just for the sake of time today, I don't have time to go into, inform the path each behavior analyst needs to follow to demonstrate medically necessary treatment to the health plan. So just starting at the beginning, at the point that the child has a detection, whether it's the child detects it or the caregiver or some other stakeholder, there's a detection of the presence of the need to potentially get a diagnosis. And in most cases, most health plans only authorize ABA services for autism. So the diagnosis is assigned, and after that, then the healthcare provider, diagnosing provider, submits a variety of referrals based on the presenting condition of the client. And they could be the things listed on the screen and potentially more, but those are the most common examples of referrals that usually populate after a diagnosis. But for today's conversation, we're going to be focused on what happens after an ABA referral is made, and the following steps in blue there are all pulled out from the standards of care that I just went through. These are all the different things that the behavior analyst needs to follow and to ensure that the client that they are assessing receives the highest quality of care. This is so that after a thorough assessment process, they can arrive at demonstrating the client requires medically necessary treatment according to the definition in the light purple box. That is our definition in the field, which is ultimately to ensure that the client receives treatment that is proportionate to the symptoms that they display and the level of need that they display during services and during the assessment. So speaking of assessment, let's talk about those assessment activities. There is a very long process, especially for new to ABA services, that takes place even before your child starts their first day of ABA services. And so if you'll remember on that slide, it starts with going to get that referral for ABA services after the diagnosis has been assigned, and then moving through, and this is the general timeline. There might be some variations based on the organization that you're with, but the general timeline of activities to get access to care. So you're going to go through an intake process with that organization based on how they have that set up. And after the intake occurs, you'll be scheduled to receive an assessment and a treatment plan will be developed. It's important that you consent to that process, and we can talk about that more here in a bit, to make sure that you understand not only the risks, but the benefits and ways to escalate your concerns should they arise during any one of those phases. After those plans are developed, the behavior analyst needs to have a conversation with you and with your partner or anybody involved in the child's life to explain what the results of the assessment mean, especially in language you can understand. And that's actually a part of our code's requirement, our code of ethics requirement, that the stakeholder understands the results. And that makes sense, right? But our field has some really weird language. So it's important that your behavior analyst is talking to you in a way that makes sense for the sake of reaching out to them. They'll submit that plan to insurance to get approval, and then typically that's when treatment starts. And again, that timeline is somewhat variable based on organization as well as the way they have that flow planned out. But once a referral occurs, usually caregivers wait to be contacted by the provider for the assessment to be scheduled. That timeline is pretty variable. It's based on a lot of things, but usually if all the elements are in place, like the right people, the resources, the health plan is set up, it can take about 10 business days. And while you're waiting for that to happen, this is your cue to get ready to prepare for that assessment to occur. So make sure that you have identified times that make the most sense for you and your family, things that you want to ask the behavior analyst when they're there, and most importantly, what you're wanting out of ABA services. That's so critical because that will help drive the assessment activities, the goal development, the treatment formulation. So even if you don't know what that is at the time that you're preparing for all this, your behavior analyst can be prepared to help you talk that through. An element of preparation includes getting your records together. And this is really important because this is going to start to piece together for the behavior analyst, whether this is your first time in services or your 50th time, the picture of the child's care up until that point. So records that are relevant include the diagnostic report, the previous treatment plans, whether it's any line of service, mental health services, occupational, speech therapy, ABA. And then based on what state you live in, they're called different things, but it's essentially the school's plan to support the child's disability or their diagnosis while they are in school. So it's IEP, ARD, a 504 plan based on, again, the child, and then any medical records to inform the writing of the treatment plan. And then it comes to the assessment activities. So you have your records ready, you have your questions ready, you have your day and your time selected. And so it's really important to know that the assessment activities to come in two forms. And this is because you're going to see both forms build on your explanation of benefits. So one of the forms is pretty obvious. It's direct. You're going to have time with the behavior analyst. They're going to spend time with you, with your child, across a variety of scenarios. The other time is maybe not so obvious. And this is one that sometimes can cause confusion or concern for caregivers, and it's that indirect time. But the nature of the service, according to health insurance, actually dictates and requires that the behavior analyst spends time reviewing the records, analyzing the results, looking at the data, writing the report themselves. So what this means is you might see a few dates of service on your EOB where you actually didn't see the behavior analyst, but this is when, and you should ask them to confirm, but this is when they are most likely performing that indirect activity. So after that comes the actual assessment itself. So the assessment itself has a variety of different components. The behavior analyst, and if you think back a few slides, there was that list of items in blue. This is what those items are. So they're going to begin with, if they haven't already, getting your consent to perform the assessment, interviewing you and any other stakeholders or caregivers that are intersect in the child's life who know a lot about the child. They're going to administer a variety of assessment tools, whether they're measures or forms for you to fill out, or they might be asking you questions and then recording your answer on like a particular form. They should be observing your child and interacting with your child, and then documenting your child's behavior. And that kind of sounds weird. Like, why would they be writing down? Like, I certainly would be kind of feeling a little conspicuous if someone's sitting in a corner, like writing about me. But this is their way to record in real time things that they know that might help or should help inform the design of treatment. When it comes to the caregiver interview, this can certainly feel a bit invasive or uncomfortable. And, I want to be sensitive to this and express that I firmly believe, and I hope, those that you are caregivers that are listening, that it is truly a privilege to spend time with you and to talk with you and ask you not only about yourself, but your child's life and how the diagnosis your child has impacted you as a family. And that might be a surprisingly emotional experience, and that's okay. But it's also important to advocate for yourself through the process. So, sometimes providers are required by health insurance to administer certain types of assessments that ask like really like sensitive or intimate questions. And it's okay for you, and you should advocate for yourself. You should say, hey, why are you asking that? Or why are you needing this information? How does this relate to this service? Because it should relate to the service, and they should be able to answer that. But if you're uncomfortable, you should feel confident in reaching out to the health plan and saying, hey, look, I know that you've told them to ask me these things, but I'm not okay with that. And I'd like to know what your plan B is. Because you need to feel okay with the process the whole way. And if at any point you don't, be aware and be okay with just raising your hand and asking for support. While the behavior analyst is spending time with you and your child, they might be administering some of these assessments. And this is what I've been referring to. So, on the screen there's some things that look like books or manuals. And so those things the behavior analyst might be reading from or might be referring to. And at other times, they might be playing with your child or what looks like playing. But in actuality, they're evaluating your client's response to questions or directions. They're recording maybe how long it took for them to complete a task or evaluating if they completed a task correctly. And all of this information is used to inform the goals for treatment and the plan that they have to provide services. So another component of working with your child during the assessment phase is to simply observe them. And that, like I said before, might kind of sound a little weird, especially if you've never seen this before, but it's really relevant because the simple act of just watching and then, writing down different things that occur helps the behavior analyst to understand the child even better. And it's important that the behavior analyst has the opportunity to see the child across different settings of relevance. Like if the child's, struggling at home or maybe at school or maybe at the clinic. And all of this is dependent on the health plan's willingness to allow them to work in those different settings, but also times a day. Like if the child has a really tough time around 3 p.m., it might be helpful to schedule an observation. Let your behavior analyst know, hey, 3 p.m. is a rough time for us. And this would be a good time for them to come and observe. But also with people of importance, like siblings, other caregivers, peers. And the whole point is for the behavior analyst to directly evaluate skills of the client, as well as observe unobtrusively. They want to make sure that, so if it seems like, well, they're just sitting in a corner and they're not paying attention to my child or not talking to my child, that's the point, melting back into the wall or back into the forest, so to speak, so that they can see what the child does without anyone interacting with them. That gives them valuable information to inform, again, the design of treatment, and then taking down that information the whole while. So this is a lot. And here's what they do with it. They write it down. They don't just write it down, though. They first of all consolidate all the information. So they're thinking about, what did the records say that I've collected thus far? What do the measures say? How can I interpret those different results? And then they put that in a summary form to pull out and identify the meaning attached to all of it. And that really helps inform what the behavior analyst is going to recommend for services for the child. And not only just services, but also helps recommend the design of the goals. What goals should be worked on, what matter for the child in terms of the next treatment period as a focus of care. Then after the assessment, the writing process has to occur. So the behavior analyst typically, now not always, but typically does the assessment activities first and then writes everything next. Now they might do some observing or assessing and then do some writing, and do some observing and assessing and then do some writing, but not always. Usually it's assess and then write. And that process may take up to 2 weeks. It's a lot of work. And so, that's something that they have to do in their regular workflow of all the other activities. And then the timelines that the insurance used to approve the plan once it's submitted varies, but usually, broadly speaking, it's around 10 to 15 business days. If you're experiencing barriers, if a plan is being especially delayed, it's always helpful for the family to call an advocate to say, hey, what's the holdup here? We've been waiting for services for 30 days now. What can we do to get things going? Sometimes the behavior analyst may not get the approval of all the hours or the goals as a response from the insurance plan. If that occurs, the behavior analyst should be discussing this with you to help you understand what happened and what that means for treatment in the upcoming treatment period. So now after you've gone through this process where your child has participated in the assessment, you and your partner, or you, if you're a single parent, have participated in that process, you now get to go to the treatment phase. And especially for families who are receiving services for the first time, this usually is, it's a big deal. I don't know how else to say it. It is a really big deal because you're going to have your child start spending time with different people for a lot of time, usually anywhere from 10 to up to 40 hours each week for an extended period of time, around 6 months. And so it's important you are prepared to understand what that looks like and what usually occurs. So when the treatment period starts, there should be a time where the behavior analyst sits down and expresses all of this information to you. But if they don't, I want to just talk about these few questions here that you should ask so that you're informed. And so beginning on the left side of the screen and moving to the right in clockwise order, you should be really clear about who is providing services. And by that, I mean, not just behavior analyst who's overseeing your child's case, but if they've used a tiered service model, who the behavior technicians or the registered behavior technicians are, who will be working when, how often the behavior analyst will be coming, if it's weekly, every other week. And then you should have a clear picture of what happens when they're there. And so you might be like, well, duh, ABA services, but beyond that. So does that mean that they're going to be spending time at the center? Does it mean that services are going to happen at the school? If so, what happens at the school? Or if it's at a clinic, what is going on at the clinic? What are they going to be doing there? If they're going to be there for 7 or 8 hours a day, how is their time going to be spent? And then you'll need to understand the when. And this is really important because families are busy. When you have kids and parents have jobs, you're super busy, and it can be hard to think about, well, when can I fit this in our lives? So it's an important discussion to have not only with your behavior analyst, but also with the family as a team to think about how to accommodate and arrange for a schedule that works, that isn't overly burdensome, but that still allows your child to receive the services that will help improve their life. And then the where. So, like I mentioned, some health plans really are pretty strict around where services can occur, whether it's school. A lot if it's not the health plan, then there's districts that will prevent behavioral analysts to come in, or if it's out in the community at Walmart, because your child just simply does not do well in large stores with bright lights and lots of people. Or if it's at a center where the client can be around other peers their same age to work on potentially social skills. And then probably the most important is the why. Why are you getting services? Why are you working on treatment? What is it that you're looking for as a result for the investment of time and energy and money and copays and resources? And this should be a part of that process that the behavior analyst reviews with you from the get-go at that initial interview. But you should see that why come into play in the real world once treatment starts. So next is, in the treatment phase is just the discussion around service models themselves. So like I mentioned, there's two main service models. There's actually a little bit more, but the two main that I'm going to go through are, first of all, a tiered service model where it's the behavior analyst and then a behavior technician or technicians. And so you should have familiarity with who the behavior analyst is and then who the behavior technicians are. And sometimes things happen, like, people leave an organization without warning, or an emergency occurs and they have to, leave their job. And so that may result in the organization not being able to give you advance notice. Hey, by the way, on Tuesday, there's going to be a new person working with your child. And that happens sometime, but largely speaking, you should have awareness, or generally speaking, you should have awareness of who is working with your child in a tiered service model. In a one-to-one model, this is where the behavior analyst is the only person working with your child. So they'll be implementing direct services throughout the entirety of the 6 months. This is it's probably a less common model because there's just not enough behavior analysts, but they do still happen and they still are available. The other part of the treatment phase is not only just the services your child receives, but you should be expecting to receive services yourself as the caregiver. Most health plans require caregivers' involvement to some extent throughout the treatment phase. And that involvement can be a little bit awkward because, we'll be really clear, no one knows your child better than you. You are your child's expert. However, it is the behavior analyst's job to help work with a caregiver to shape their skills so that they can implement aspects of the treatment plan outside of session times. And this is so that the caregiver can continue to generalize the skills that the client learns during services so that the child can be set up for success when treatment is not occurring. Understandably, that is a little bit awkward because, again, you have a person who is a non-family member who doesn't really know your family compared to, other people in your family's life, potentially telling you how to work with your child. And so this is where having a good relationship with that provider is super important so that, and we'll talk about this, you can feel comfortable raising your concerns and asking questions. And even if you maybe don't feel 100% comfortable, which is totally understandable, you should still ask those questions if you have them. So during treatment, a lot of things happen, like days are busy, things go on, and it's during this time that also sometimes you can just get used to sort of like a Groundhog Day experience where you're going to work, you're used to bringing your child to a clinic, or you're used to a provider coming over. And what I want to emphasize and encourage here is that whether it's something that you don't understand, or you like it a lot, or you have concerns, ask questions. That is so important. And it can be simple. Just tell me more about this, or help me understand what I'm seeing here. But this will allow you to understand what is occurring during treatment with your child. And it's a good way to do that like mental check to make sure that services are on the path that you and the behavior analyst talked about at the onset of care. It's also important that you participate in those caregiver trainings to work on those skills that are identified in the treatment plan to help you implement the treatment plan outside of session times. There's a lot of reasons for this. The biggest one is what research says is the most effective way to continue to strengthen the skills of your child long after care is ended and to produce the best outcomes. Also, health plans expect a report from the behavior analyst every 6 months on how the caregiver is making progress on the caregiver goals in the treatment plan. And that sounds a little odd and awkward, and I do understand that. But it is how health insurance has kind of morphed over the years. And some health plans take a pretty hard line with this. And if caregivers are not involved and there's not a good reason, they're just, maybe they haven't made the space or the time, this can cause some services to end before the child has reached their treatment goals. So this is a really important piece to work out with your behavior analyst to make sure that those training times they're doable for your schedule, that you're also making progress on the goals that are identified. And if they're not working for you, or if you're not finding success in them, use those trainings to say, hey, this isn't what I thought it would be, or this isn't, having the effect that you said it would have. And while treatment is occurring, make sure that you continue to stay informed. Ask your behavior analyst about the goals in the plan and how they're making progress. And if the behavior analyst is like, yeah, they're doing great with tap dancing now, and they're also fluent in French, that should cause a flag if that's not goals, right? So I'm giving that silly illustration to say, if any changes happen during the treatment period to your child's goals, or maybe there's a major intervention change where, the child is going to use some kind of system that's brand new to them, those changes should be made with your foreknowledge and consent. That is part of our ethical requirement as behavior analysts to communicate that to caregivers and have that discussion before we go ahead and make the change. This is so that we can get your feedback, give you opportunity to ask questions, describe any risks or benefits to you, and more importantly, just to inform you as the caregiver who is responsible for the child, to make sure that you're okay with what we feel is clinically necessary for next steps. So treatment is happening, but there's always what ifs. What if you're uncertain about the process or what the behavior analyst is doing? What if you don't understand what they're doing? Like, if an RBT is maybe a registered behavior technician is sitting in the corner and they're not talking to the child for 30 minutes, like, is that treatment? Or what if you don't see results? What if your child has been in services for 2 months and there's no change in their behavior at all? Or maybe what if things only get worse? How do you handle those kinds of situations, especially with a person that, or an organization where you've been paying them, seeing them regularly, you've got to know them? Should you raise those concerns, and how should you do it? So obviously the answer is yes, you should raise those concerns, and you should do it through communication. It's not always the most comfortable situation to go to another person who's been working closely with your child, especially if you're nervous, if that might impact your services and you've been waiting for like a year or something to get services started, to put the risk at, to put your child's care at risk, if that's what your fear is. But you should feel confident in advocating for you to understand and to make sure that your child is making the progress that you're expecting them to make. So the point of treatment, just to remind you, is to make sure that the treatment matters to you and your family. So if it's causing you concern, communicate that concern. So providing the behavior analyst with information or feedback around the acceptability and the effectiveness of treatment is so crucial, because it allows them to take that information and make necessary adjustments to support your child. And the behavior analyst should be aware of you doing this. If this does happen, this shouldn't be a surprise to them. Not because they are used to getting complaints, but their training should prepare them for having those conversations with you. And ideally, they should make you feel like you're a priority, you matter, and your concerns are the utmost important. And if you have those conversations that can be kind of, at times uncomfortable, that's great. But don't let it be a one and done. If you've addressed something and an issue continues to arise, circle back to it and make sure that you continue to raise concerns until that challenge is solved. You are an essential part of the treatment team. So your child has a treatment team made up of a variety of different people, but you are critical to your child's success. And if you're not feeling right about what is happening, definitely embrace the opportunity when it arises to speak up. So there might be situations, though, where maybe you have raised it with the behavior analyst and you've brought up those concerns and you've said, hey, I want to talk about this thing that keeps happening and it's just not getting better. You might think, what do I do then? Most organizations should have identified at the onset of services or at somewhere in their handbook or their paperwork a pathway to communicate those concerns. It might be an email, it might be a phone number, like a compliance line, and you should take that opportunity to reach out and express the thoughts that you have about what is going on. If you're not able to find that information, then reach out to the leader of the organization to let them know that this is happening. The leader always wants to know, what is going on with the clients and the families that are being served. So I know, again, that might feel a little intimidating, but feel free to advocate for your child and for yourself as their caregiver. There might be also situations where maybe it's so egregious or so uncomfortable that it rises to the level submitting a complaint to the state licensure board or the certification body like the BACB. And so there are different routes to take, but most state licensure websites will have clear links to show you how to report a complaint. And they'll have information on, what you should report, information that you need to share with them so that they can follow up. And the same is true with certification bodies like the BACB. There's information on, what you need to do to raise that concern. That also might feel a little overwhelming or intimidating, but don't let that give you pause. If you feel like you have a serious concern that hasn't been met or is affecting your child's care, it is your absolute right to raise that concern to those different entities. One consideration around that is understanding that when you make complaints to the state or to a certification body, the investigation can take some time. And by that, I mean anywhere from months to years. So just be prepared to wait, but also there usually is some type of cadence of communication about the status of your complaint throughout that investigation process. It just depends on the nature of the complaint and who you're reporting to. So with that, I am going to go to the questions to see if anybody has questions or comments that they want to provide. And I see there is a question in the chat box, actually. So the question is, we just got autism waiver services for our child. How would that impact ABA therapy for our child? Is there collaboration with autism waiver service providers and Verbal Beginnings? That is a great question. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about the autism waiver services, or Emily, if you know what that is, since I am not in Maryland.
Yeah, so we definitely can coordinate with any other providers that you're working with to make sure that our treatment aligns and that skills are generalizing across people that you're working with. So I have seen your email and I'm working with your clinical supervisor to make sure that we can coordinate with anybody that you want us to. So we'll follow up soon about that. Thank you.
Great, Emily, thank you. Any other questions from anybody on this eve of Thanksgiving Eve? And while you guys are thinking about that, I'm just going to go to the last slide for you, Emily.
Yeah, so this is going to be our topic for next month's autism exploration meeting. That will be on December 12th at 5, and it is on AAC devices, or augmentative and alternative communication. And that is going to be presented by Lindsay Keller, who is from the Tobii Dynavox company, which is one of the companies that has one of the AAC devices and programs that they use, but it'll be informational on all types of AAC devices and programs.
Perfect. That's exciting. Thanks for sharing that.
And that is it for today. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you next month at the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, all.
Okay.